In the summer of 2006, a 23-year-old MIT undergraduate named Drew Houston bought a bus ticket from Boston to New York and settled into his seat with 4 hours ahead of him and a plan to spend them writing code. He reached into his bag and discovered he had left his USB flash drive on his desk in his dormitory room. The files he needed were 215 miles behind him. He opened his laptop anyway, and for 4 hours, while the Massachusetts Turnpike rolled past his window, he built the first rough architecture of a system that would allow him to reach any file he owned from any machine on Earth. He would call it Dropbox. What he built on that bus would eventually store data for more than 700 million registered users across 180 countries, grow into one of the most valuable private technology companies in American history, and then spend a decade being steadily displaced by the forces it had never been able to escape. The operating systems that other companies owned, the hardware those companies sold, and the free storage those companies could offer as a permanent amenity to every customer they already had. Drew Houston was born in 1983 in Acton, Massachusetts, the son of an electrical engineer. He began programming at 8 years old on a Macintosh, building small games before he fully understood what programming was. He enrolled at MIT in 2002, studied electrical engineering and computer science, and by his junior year was running a software company called Accolade on the side, a poker analytics platform that helped online players track their performance at the tables. It generated enough revenue to pay his rent and never enough to feel like the thing he was supposed to be building. He was 22 years old and already writing his second company from scratch, which is either a sign of extraordinary ambition or an early indication that the first company was never the point. The USB drive incident in the summer of 2006 clarified what the point was: not a new piece of software, a new relationship between a person and their files. Permanent and automatic and invisible and free from the tyranny of a small plastic object that could be left on any desk in any city. He applied to Y Combinator in the spring of 2007. Paul Graham, the co-founder of the Seed Accelerator, told him that solo founders were statistically weaker than founding teams, and that Houston needed a co-founder before the program would take his application seriously. Houston went looking inside MIT and found Arash Firdausi, a 20-year-old electrical engineering and computer science student who was 1 semester from completing his degree. Firdausi had spent 4 years working toward a credential that was now, in the conversation Houston was proposing, an obstacle to something more interesting. He left school. Y Combinator accepted them into the summer 2007 batch, and the two of them moved into a small office in Mountain View and began building. When Paul Graham pressed Houston in the Y Combinator interview about the number of competing storage and synchronization services already in the market, Houston answered that they all had the same flaw. Every one of them required the user to do something. Dropbox would require the user to do nothing. That answer, delivered in a conference room to a skeptical investor, is the entire product strategy in a single sentence. The technical problem they were addressing was not new. Online storage services had existed for years. xDrive, Box.net, and Apple's own iDisk offered accessible file storage in various forms. Every one of them required the user to navigate a web interface to upload files deliberately, to remember which device held the current version of a document. Dropbox removed the conscious act entirely. You installed a folder, you put files into it. Every device you owned updated automatically and silently, continuously comparing what it held against what every other device held, and resolving the differences without being asked. The synchronization ran in the background without requesting attention or demanding decisions. The entire design philosophy was built around a single conviction: the best technology is the technology you never have to think about. In an industry filled with services that required users to change their behavior, Dropbox asked for almost none. The experience was the product. The engineering underneath it was the secret. And the secret was that synchronization only felt effortless because every edge case, every file conflict, every interrupted upload had been thought through and resolved before the user ever had a chance to notice anything had gone wrong. In April 2007, before the product was fully built at commercial scale, Houston posted a 3-minute screencast to Hacker News and Dig. The video did not show a finished application. It showed a concept, a folder keeping itself synchronized across multiple machines, narrated with the dry precision of someone who had built the thing and understood exactly what distinguished it from every alternative. Houston embedded references to GNU Emacs and the Linux mascot, technical jokes aimed at the developers and early adopters who would become Dropbox's first believers. The audience that caught those jokes shared the video. The beta waitlist went from 5,000 names to 75,000 overnight. The product did not yet exist at the scale the interest required. The demand had arrived before the infrastructure capable of serving it. Sequoia Capital led the first institutional funding round in 2007, investing $1.2 million. The infrastructure Ferdowsi and Houston built during those early months ran on Amazon Web Services rather than proprietary data centers, a practical choice made under capital constraints that would later carry a particular irony. Amazon would spend the following decade building cloud infrastructure and storage products that competed in parallel and directly with the company it was hosting. The commercial engine of Dropbox's early growth was a referral program that Houston has described as the most consequential business decision the company made in its founding years. The mechanism was adapted from PayPal's viral expansion playbook. Refer a friend, receive 500 megabytes of additional free storage. The friend who signed up received the same amount. The cost to Dropbox was disk space, which was declining in price each year. The cost to acquire a user through this channel was roughly $1. The lifetime revenue from a user who converted to a paid plan was approximately $100. At those economics, giving away storage to generate referrals was not generosity. It was the highest margin customer acquisition strategy in the history of consumer software. The user base grew by 3,900% in 15 months without $1 of conventional advertising. By April 2010, the service had 4 million registered users. By late 2011, that number was 50 million. Sometime around 2009, Steve Jobs contacted Houston through Apple's corporate channels and invited him to Cupertino. Jobs was building what would become iCloud, intended to replace MobileMe, Apple's earlier attempt at cloud synchronization that had failed so publicly that Jobs had addressed it at an all-hands meeting with a level of visible frustration that became part of company legend. He believed Dropbox could be acquired and built into the platform Apple was constructing. Jobs had been thinking about the problem of digital continuity for years. His vision was a world where a user's photographs, documents, and applications were not tethered to any single device, but followed them naturally and automatically across every Apple product they owned. Dropbox had already proved that users wanted exactly that. The precise acquisition figure has never been confirmed by either party. Accounts from people familiar with the discussions have cited sums in the range of several $100 million. Houston declined. Jobs told him, in terms Houston has recounted publicly on multiple occasions, that Dropbox was a feature, not a product. That features could be built into operating systems. That operating systems reached hundreds of millions of devices. that no subscription business could sustain itself competing with a platform that owned the operating layer the subscription was standing on. Houston flew back to San Francisco. You can read that refusal two ways, and honest history holds both at once. One reading says Houston was right about the product. Dropbox's cross-platform architecture ran identically on Mac, Windows, Linux, iOS, and Android. It had been designed from the first line of code to feel native on whatever machine you were using, regardless of who manufactured it. Apple's iCloud would serve Apple users. A significant portion of the working world operated across both platforms, using a Mac at home and a Windows machine at the office, and needed a service that followed them across that boundary without friction. By that reading, the refusal was accurate product thinking, the judgment of a founder who understood his technology better than the man offering to buy it. The other reading says Jobs was also right, that a company whose core value could be replicated at the operating system layer and offered as a permanent free amenity to every hardware customer was always approaching a ceiling that subscription and economics alone could never break through. Both readings are correct. That they are simultaneously correct is not a paradox. It is the precise shape of the problem Dropbox chose to build its entire business inside. In October 2011, 8 days after Steve Jobs died, Apple launched iCloud. It offered 5 gigabytes of free storage, automatic photo backup, document synchronization for Apple applications, and integration embedded so deeply into iOS and macOS that it required no installation, no separate account, and no deliberate action by the user. You turned on a new iPhone, and iCloud was already running. Before iCloud, Dropbox had been one of the most downloaded applications in the App Store, the natural choice for iPhone users who needed their files to follow them across devices. iCloud changed that arithmetic in a single afternoon. The door that Dropbox had occupied on every new iPhone became a side entrance, and the traffic that had made that position valuable relocated to an option Apple had installed, would maintain permanently, and would never charge separately to use. For the casual user, the person who had come to Dropbox through a referral link and used it to keep documents accessible between a laptop and a phone, iCloud was sufficient. It was already present, it cost nothing, and it worked. Dropbox had 50 million users when iCloud launched. It reached 100 million within the following year. The raw growth numbers looked like vindication. What they concealed was a conversion problem that would define the company's trajectory for the decade ahead. Of those 100 million registered users, the great majority occupied the free tier, which provided 2 gigabytes of storage. 2 gigabytes was enough to carry documents and share project files, enough to confirm that cloud synchronization worked as advertised. It was not enough to compel payment from users who now received 5 gigabytes from Apple at no cost and 15 from Google for the same price. The users most likely to pay, the iPhone owners who needed photographs backed up and files universally accessible, were finding that iCloud handled that task without a separate application, a separate login, or a separate monthly bill. In April 2012, Google launched Drive with 15 gigabytes of free storage integrated directly into Gmail and Google Docs, accessible to anyone with a Google account, which by that point meant approximately 425 million people. Microsoft expanded SkyDrive, later renamed OneDrive, bundling cloud storage into Windows 8 and into the Office subscription that millions of businesses already maintained. Amazon launched its own cloud drive service. Within 18 months of iCloud's arrival, the 4 largest technology companies in the world had committed to providing cloud storage as a permanent feature of their existing products at no additional charge. They could do this because their scale made the marginal cost trivial and because cloud storage kept users inside ecosystems that generated revenue through hardware, advertising, and enterprise contracts that Dropbox did not have. Dropbox had the folder. And the folder, by itself, was not a position any company could hold indefinitely against competitors who could subsidize the same service from other revenue permanently. What Dropbox retained was cross-platform fidelity and the trusted simplicity of the folder metaphor. A Dropbox file behaved identically on a MacBook, a Windows machine, and an Android phone. A Google Drive file required extra steps on Windows. Microsoft OneDrive needed configuration on a Mac. A Dropbox folder was simply a folder. That distinction mattered to enterprise users, creative professionals, and anyone who moved between operating systems daily without the patience for configuration. Aaron Levy, who had co-founded Box in 2005 with a deliberate focus on business customers, had built a competing position inside corporate IT by framing cloud storage as a security and compliance infrastructure rather than a consumer convenience. Box and Dropbox competed for the same enterprise accounts across the following decade, a competition that kept both companies viable in business markets even as the consumer storage wars became impossible to win. By 2014, Dropbox had raised a funding round valuing the company at $10 billion, placing it among the most valuable private technology startups in the United States. Revenue had grown from $116 million in 2012 to $603 million in 2014. The enterprise business was real. The underlying conversion problem was also real. Both facts were moving toward each other. Houston understood before most of his board acknowledged it publicly that the folder alone was not a sufficient foundation for the growth expectations a public company would carry. From 2013 onward, he was describing the transformation of Dropbox into what he called a smart workspace, a platform where teams could store files and coordinate the work built around them. In 2013, the company acquired Mailbox, a mobile email client with a waiting list that had reached nearly 1 million people before the app officially launched, for a reported $100 million. Mailbox was intended to extend Dropbox's reach from file storage into communication, positioning the platform as the center of how teams moved both files and messages. By December 2015, Dropbox shut Mailbox down. The product had not grown into the platform role the acquisition envisioned, and the resources required to maintain it were needed elsewhere. Dropbox launched Paper in 2015, a collaborative document editor positioned alongside Google Docs in the market for team writing tools. It was well-reviewed and modestly adopted. In 2019, the company acquired HelloSign for $230 million, a digital signature platform that provided a natural foothold in legal and administrative workflows where document management intersected with approval processes. The acquisition was sensible and the integration was handled cleanly. It was also a measure of how far the company had traveled from its founding problem. A business that began by solving the frustration of files that could not follow their owner had arrived at electronic signatures. And the distance between those two things was not a gap a single product launch could close. On March 23, 2018, Dropbox went public on NASDAQ under the symbol DBX. Shares were priced at $21. By the close of the first trading day, they had reached $28.48, giving the company a market capitalization of approximately $12 billion. It was the largest technology IPO of the year at the time of listing. The company reported more than 500 million registered users and full-year revenue of approximately $1.1 billion. It also reported approximately 11 million paying customers. The ratio between those two figures, 500 million users, and 11 million who paid, was the story the prospectus told quietly in its risk disclosures, in the sections investor presentations rarely dwell on. A conversion rate of roughly 2%. Every person who bought into the growth story of cloud storage was now holding stock in a company whose central commercial challenge was persuading the other 98% that what they received for free was insufficient, in a market where Apple, Google, and Microsoft had already committed to making it sufficient forever. The stock reached past $35 in early 2021. Remote work had arrived as a permanent operating condition for a significant portion of the professional economy almost overnight. Organizations that had never seriously evaluated cloud file sharing tools were suddenly dependent on them to keep distributed teams functioning. Companies that had managed with shared network drives and email attachments discovered in the spring of 2020 that those systems were not designed for teams that were no longer in the same building. Dropbox was. Revenue grew from $1.91 billion in 2020 to $2.16 billion in 2021. Business subscriptions climbed. For roughly 12 months, the smart workspace thesis appeared to be accelerating toward a market that necessity had created faster than any product roadmap had projected. Then the emergency conditions lifted. The acceleration slowed. Companies that had adopted cloud collaboration tools out of urgency began rationalizing their subscriptions. The structural problem that had been present since iCloud's launch returned to the center of every quarterly analyst conversation. In January 2023, Dropbox laid off approximately 500 employees, around 16% of its global workforce. Houston announced the reductions in a letter to the company that named the shift toward artificial intelligence and the need to concentrate resources on the next generation of products. The logic was honest and stated plainly. Competing on storage economics against companies whose storage costs were subsidized by other revenue streams was not a viable long-term strategy, and the platform needed to become something different or accept the permanent constraints of being only what it already was. In April 2024, Dropbox announced a second round of reductions, cutting approximately 20% of its remaining global workforce and reorganizing around Dropbox Dash, an artificial intelligence-powered search product designed to help users locate files and information across multiple applications simultaneously. The AI pivot was technically serious and commercially necessary. It was also a public acknowledgement, stated in the language of a corporate press release, that the folder had reached the limit of what it could carry on its own. You can read the full distance between the Mountain View office in 2007 and those two rounds of reductions in two ways. An honest history requires holding both without resolution. One reading says, Dropbox made the error most characteristic of category creators. It built a product so fundamental that it defined an expectation, and then watched that expectation be absorbed by platforms with the resources to satisfy it indefinitely at no charge. That the cross-platform advantage was real, that the enterprise business was real, that the revenue was real, and that none of it was sufficient against the structural asymmetry between a standalone subscription company and four platform companies for whom storage was a retention mechanism they could price at zero forever. The other reading says Dropbox moved too slowly toward the second act, its first act made necessary, that the acquisitions arrived in sequence rather than ahead of the competition they were meant to address, and that the folder was always too narrow a foundation for the company Houston was trying to build on top of it. Honest history does not arbitrate between these readings. It holds both. Because what happened to Dropbox is not the story of a single decisive mistake. It is the story of a company that executed its founding vision with rare precision and still arrived at a position where precision was not enough. What Dropbox built is not only a product, it is a behavioral expectation now embedded in how hundreds of millions of people relate to their own work. Before Dropbox, most users understood at some practical level that their files lived on a particular machine. After Dropbox, hundreds of millions of people stopped thinking about where their files lived at all. The expectation that data follows you automatically across every device you own, without deliberate action and without awareness of the technology underneath it, is an expectation that Dropbox created. Apple built iCloud to meet that expectation. Google built Drive to meet it. Microsoft expanded OneDrive to meet it. None of them originated it. Dropbox did, and then found itself competing to satisfy the expectation it had built against companies for whom satisfying it was a customer retention strategy they could fund from other revenue streams permanently. The referral program that grew Dropbox from 5,000 names to 50 million users without conventional advertising became the template for viral growth mechanics that the following decade of consumer software companies replicated across every category imaginable. The screencast demo video that turned a waitlist of 5,000 into 75,000 overnight is studied in product marketing courses as the standard for explaining a technology by demonstrating the problem it eliminates rather than the engineering it contains. The freemium model, free storage up to a limit with paid tiers above it, had existed before Dropbox, but Dropbox proved it at a scale and with an efficiency that made it the commercial default for software-as-a-service businesses for the decade that followed. Every cloud service that offers a free tier and hopes to convert a fraction of it into paying subscribers is operating inside the economic architecture that Dropbox demonstrated was viable, even when that fraction proved insufficient to sustain the company that pioneered it. Arash Ferdowsi, the MIT student who left one semester before graduation to build something with someone he barely knew, stepped down from Dropbox's board of directors in 2020. The departure received little public attention. He had spent 13 years building the infrastructure that hundreds of millions of people used every day without knowing his name. The synchronization logic beneath the folder, the conflict resolution system that kept files from colliding when two people edited the same document from different machines, the architecture that made a desktop folder feel connected to the whole world. He was 20 years old when he left school. He was 33 when he left the board. The years between produced software that became the unconscious infrastructure of modern professional memory. His name does not appear in the product the world uses because Dropbox does not come in packaging and never did. And the engineers who build things that function invisibly are the engineers that history most reliably forgets. On a bus rolling south from Boston in the summer of 2006, Drew Houston opened a laptop and began building the solution to a problem that had frustrated him for the last time. He did not know that the solution would store the working files of 700 million people. He did not know that the man he would later turn down had already named the exact mechanism that would constrain what he was building. He did not know that solving the problem correctly would eventually persuade the 4 largest technology companies on Earth to solve it themselves, permanently, for free. He knew that his files were in a dormitory room in Boston and that they should have been able to follow him to New York. He built the thing that solved that problem. The problem was solved, and then the solution became so obvious and so necessary that it stopped belonging to the company that invented it and became part of the infrastructure that everyone assumed had always been there. Dropbox did not lose the cloud. Dropbox built the expectation of the cloud, proved it could exist as a business, and then watched the architecture of that expectation be claimed by platforms that had the resources to make it permanent. The folder that Houston started building on a bus is inside every cloud service that followed. The company whose name is on it has never been quite the same since the others understood what a folder could become. The USB drive that Drew Houston left on his desk in that dormitory room in 2006 is almost certainly long gone. But the problem it represented, the gap between where your work lives and where you need it to be, has been solved for most of the connected world in a way that makes Dropbox invisible even when it is still running. If you stored your first important file in a Dropbox folder, if you shared a project across time zones and watched it update in real time without lifting a finger, if you received that referral email and signed up because 500 megabytes felt like more storage than you could ever fill, drop a comment below. Tell us the year, the folder, and whether you are still paying for it. The people who adopted Dropbox before cloud storage was obvious know more about what was built here than the platforms that replaced it. Subscribe, because this archive is still being built. We have the story of another American technology company coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.